Celeste is a 2D platformer game about a young girl trying to reach the summit of a mountain with the same name as the game. It was inspired by many platformer games including Super Mario Bros. 3, Super Metroid, Donkey Kong Country 3, and many more. It was originally created for the Pico 8 console as a basic and simple platformer game that the developers wanted to create within a short period of time. Celeste starts out with the game's protagonist named Madeline, a young aspiring mountain climber hoping to climb to the peak of Celeste Mountain. She faces many challenges throughout her adventure, including facing her own doubts. Celeste is a story that talks about depression, anxiety, and self-doubt alongside other mental health issues. Madeline faces the darker part of herself as the main antagonist known as Dark Madeline, or Madeline by the fanbase, showing the players that the only enemy she had ever had was herself. Although Madeline experiences many challenges, she overcomes them throughout the game with the help of her friends. However, at a much later part of the game, Madeline throws Madeline back to the bottom of the mountain and hits rock bottom, both physically and emotionally. Just as she was about to turn back, the old lady she met at the beginning of the game appeared before her and started teasing her, in a good way. She helped Madeline realize that maybe she and Madeline can work together. So Madeline confronts Madeline, and after a long, exhausting fight, they end up working together. Although there was still some bad tension between the two, they still ended up making it to the summit of Celeste Mountain. The story of Celeste does not present a complete ending to Madeline's struggles. In fact, the game's DLC shows her having fallen back to her depression after she finds out that Granny passed away. The story does not show Madeline leaving her after she reached the peak of the mountain, just like what really happens in real life. Instead, it shows her learning to work with that part of her. Celeste was inspired by the real-life struggles of co-creator Matty Thorson with his mental health. Although Celeste talks about mental health, it wasn't mainly intended to spread awareness about mental health, but to tell a story of someone who struggles with it, even for those who do not fully understand it. Celeste starts off easy, showing the player the controls and introducing the characters of the story, especially Madeline, whom they will play throughout the game. Challenges and puzzles are not that difficult early in the game. However, they are still challenging. As the game progresses, levels get harder and more challenges, puzzles, and boss fights are introduced. One of the great little details added in Celeste was how the game shows Madeline's anxiety. In one part of the game, Madeline breaks down in a panic attack. During this, the screen became dark, almost shadowy, and the screen shrinks into a smaller frame. And we meet a familiar face during her panic attack, Madeline. Theo, one of the characters introduced to Madeline at the beginning of the game, tries to help her calm down and gives the player control of a feather to help Madeline breathe. In the game, whenever Madeline doubts herself, the levers get harder and harder. The more Madeline's anxiety attacks, the harder the level gets. This also shows the level's dependency on the story, which is cool. Celeste can be played in many different ways. Although there are some levels that can be completed in a linear way, most levels were designed to be completed in more than one single strategy. Players could dash, then jump, or they can jump and then dash. It really depends on the strategy they're taking. If you as the player want more of a challenge, there are several different collectibles to be collected in all the chapters, including the strawberries and the B-side tapes. These B-side tapes let you replay the chapter with more of a challenge. Or if you want to concentrate on finishing the game, you can completely skip these collectibles and continue on with the story. The choice is really up to you. Celeste probably has one of the best game mechanics created for a platform. Madeline has 4 basic moves: run, jump, climb, and dash. These 4 controls are very simple to use and easy to remember. All of them were coded to make Madeline feel human. The run and jump curves, along with the movement numbers, were just enough to make her feel human. The controls of Celeste were responding almost instantly whenever inputted, which was the developer's intent. In fact, co-creator Matty Thorson said, "It's like working on the player's intent rather than creating a perfect simulation of pressing buttons at the correct time." Celeste was developed using Visual Studio with the help of Microsoft XNA using C# language. The developers wanted to have full control of the numbers and codes, so they didn't use any pre-programmed assets you would normally use from game engines. For example, they did not use any gravity assets you would normally use in Unity. Most of the game was created through trial and error. In fact, the game was constantly being tested by friends of the developers, and changes were made based on the reactions of the players and the developers watching them.
The level design of Celeste revolves around its capability to tell a story that is easy to understand. Each area tells a different story, and each level within that area tells a smaller story as well. This focus on story is what allowed the levels to be constructed in such a manner. Each level may revolve around certain mechanics, a certain emotion, or perhaps teach the player about a certain aspect without overwhelming them with a wall of text. Pacing, progression, and player improvement. As the game progresses, so does the player's capability to traverse through the levels in the game. This promotes player exploration, experimentation, and creativity, which could tell a story of its own. The levels themselves are relatively short in length, focusing more on a certain aspect rather than giving the player a long endurance test. Progression in application, the early stages. As observed in each area's pacing, levels generally start in a relatively slow and calming manner. This is done in order to give the player some time to familiarize themselves with new mechanics. Since the game doesn't have a proper tutorial, this early stage serves as an area of exploration and experimentation. A mistake during this phase is generally forgiving, allowing the player to progress through the middle stages with relative difficulty. Progression in application, the middle of the journey. Past the introduction stages of the game, patterns and level layouts become more complex. In this stage of the game, precise movement is recommended, but not to an extreme extent, as some room for error is still allowed by the game. Slightly more complicated mechanics will also be introduced in this stage of the game. Progression in application, the final climb. The final stretch, a set of consecutive challenges which test the player's skills and knowledge. Near the end of the game is where the game is the least forgiving. Precision, agility, and mastery of mechanics are heavily utilized in this stage of the game. Everything that the player has learned along their journey is tested here, with the reward being the final steps to climbing Celeste Mountain. The entire philosophy of the game's level design revolves around climbing a mountain. This is seen both in literal and figurative implications, the former being the entire game's premise of climbing Celeste Mountain, while the latter implies the player's limits, better known as the mountain, which they have to climb in order to progress.
What is game art? Well, to put it simply, game art is the visual elements you see while playing a game. The game art could be the environment, the characters, the visual effects, the animations, and many more. Basically, it's everything you see when you play a game. In this section of the video, I'll describe the creative processes behind the development of the visual style of Celeste, starting with environment design. This is Mount Celeste, the name of the mountain that you're set out to climb. This is where the whole game takes place as it represents the 7 main chapters you will encounter. Aside from that, it also helps illustrate your journey in reaching the goal, the summit. Each chapter in Celeste has its own visual theme, which ensures the gameplay doesn't get too monotonous and boring. For instance, the first chapter, Forsaken City, portrays a desolate metropolis set against a cold, bleak background, along with dangerous terrain and crumbling buildings. In the 5th chapter of the game, the Mirror Temple, you are faced with gloomy and unsettling scenes colored in reds and purples that make you feel claustrophobic, as well as creatures that seek and chase you. Almost everything in this temple is designed to make you feel anxious and uncomfortable. The 7th chapter, The Summit, is a thrilling change compared to the previous stages. The atmosphere in this chapter is brighter, more uplifting, and more exciting. You will feel elated and ecstatic as this stage propels you closer to the summit. It's interesting to note that although each chapter has a unique visual theme, the art style remains consistent, which is achieved by keeping the same pixel sizes and making them prominent throughout the game, so that even though the chapters look different, they all seem to belong to the same world. The characters drive most of the story and gameplay in Celeste. Each of the characters immerses you to the story and helps you enjoy the game more. Even though all of the characters in Celeste have unique personalities and aesthetic features, we're going to focus on Madeline, the main character of Celeste. Being the only playable character in the game, much of the environment revolves around her design to ensure that their aesthetics correspond with each other. For instance, take a look at this video and notice that no matter how crazy the environment looks around Madeline, you can easily distinguish her in the background. But how? How can she look so noticeable with all the crazy things going on in the background? Well, one of the main reasons is the color. Most of the colors used on Madeline contrast with her surroundings. Here is Madeline in Chapter 1's Forsaken City as an example. Notice how the background color is much darker, cooler, and less saturated than the colors in Madeline. This use of color contrast aids in identifying Madeline's form, shape, and position, which is helpful in fast-paced games like Celeste. Another reason would be visual responsiveness. To be visually responsive means to ensure that the user is aware of their actions. For example, your hair becomes blue when you run over dash or the sweat particles while climbing, which indicate that you have run out of stamina. These little things with readability impact the gameplay massively and are partly the reason why Celeste is so satisfying to play.
Celeste Sound Design. To begin with, who is Celeste Sound Designer? The game's soundtrack was written by Lina Rain, and Kevin Regame serves as the project sound designer. Kevin Regame is a creative director at Power Up Audio Inc. and a former sound designer at Somatone Interactive Audio. He brings a range of expertise to the table regarding music design, voiceover, and performance. Moving on, what instruments were employed in game sound and music during the project's development? First is FMOD, is a licensed sound effect processor production software for video games and applications. FMOD is used as the sound effect and music of the game. Second is Ableton Live, is a digital recording workstation for macOS and Windows used as the digital audio workstation of the game. Third is Massive, is a wavetable freeware generator tool made for professional audio production and used as a generator tool of the game. Fourth is Spitfire, is a method for creating sample collections for instruments that are used in music composition. Spitfire is used as the felt piano plugin of the game. Next is Celeste soundtrack. For chapters 1 to 4, it has 15 soundtracks. And for chapters 5 to 8, it has 12 soundtracks. And for chapter 9, it has 25 soundtracks. Next is the Celeste sound description. The soundtrack accompanying the gameplay in Celeste mostly captures the main character's anxiousness and other emotions, which are extensively emphasized throughout the game. Then there are sound effects and ambient noises which will help the gameplay and the game immersion. The game and the game soundtracks are organized into chapters. One or more soundtracks are provided for each chapter to enable the player to navigate the gameplay. When the player begins playing the game, the sound effects in the beginning are soothing expressive. It is appropriate for each action taken by the game's main characters, side characters, objects, and locations, while the project's main soundtrack sounds incredibly calming and enjoying at the same time. During the game, the player gets the sense that they are actually playing inside the game, mainly because of the sound effect, graphics, animation, and other things on it. Its audio transitions smoothly and accurately to the game's event and subsequent scenes. I love how they loop the sound effect of the game. At the end of the game's final chapter, the beat sequences are used appropriately throughout the gameplay. With an accurate, great soundscape, it depicts the main character triumphs and the game's ending and conclusion.
Before the Celeste we know today, the game's idea came to life between Maddie Thorson and Noel Berry. The two had decided to attend the Game Jam, an event where the participants tried to make a video game from scratch on Pico 8 in just 4 days. Noel, one of the developers, mentions their plan to make a game with a minimalistic concept, partially because of Pico 8's limitations and the time constraints set by themselves, while maintaining depth in the game's mechanics. This game ended up to be a difficult platformer with 30 levels that challenges the player's speedrunning and precision skills. Pico 8 Celeste was then renamed to Celeste Classic, released online for anyone to play, and has received a positive response from a lot of people. Fast forward a few months after Celeste Classic's release, Maddie and Noel had planned to spend a few months expanding the game into something bigger, so they approached Amora Bettany and Pedro Medeiros to make the artwork for their game. Both Maddie and Noel have worked with them before, on Maddie's previous game Towerfall, and Noel's own game Skytorn, which was never released. They've then received lots of support from their friends who would playtest the game levels and give feedback to the developers as they play. Likewise, they would make changes according to their feedback straight away. Throughout the process, Maddie and Noel haven't determined how they would go about the game storyline. A few of the characters were already added in the game while they were making the levels. Not until a few chapters were done game and level wise, things started falling into place, and the developers would then go back to the previous chapters to change or add something with the characters' dialogues. Maddie initially had the idea of the story and took a major role in writing it. In July 2016, the game was publicly announced for the first time, and the developers had streamed some of the project's development on Twitch. Celeste had its first playable demo version at PAX West at the Indie Mega booth. The developer's initial plan was to officially release Celeste around April 2017, the same time as the release of the Nintendo Switch. However, that release date had moved all the way to January 2018 and was made available on Nintendo Switch, PS4, Xbox One, Windows, Linux, and macOS.
Celeste's overall reception has been overwhelmingly positive with a Metascore of 94 on its Xbox One release, 92 for its Nintendo Switch release, 91 on its PlayStation 4 release, and 88 for its PC release, along with a multitude of rewards. Celeste has also accumulated an estimated total of 500,000 sales across all the release platforms combined, and an estimated 1 million sales near the end of 2019. Next is the Celeste Awards during 2018 to 2019. And lastly, here are some reviews of the game Celeste.
With its fun yet challenging levels, as well as its relatable characters, Celeste has been a huge success in the gaming world. This game not only tells of a story, but also reminds players that no matter how much flaws a human being can get, it's okay to start over and try again. Thanks so much for watching.